We're good. All right, so just going to go through, take attendance. If you have any questions over what we covered, go ahead, get those ready. And we could answer them. If anyone's online watching, you can go ahead and type your questions in the chat box. We'll start with questions. All right. Do what I am required. All right, cool. Morning. One more Monday. One more Monday. How many Mondays left? 9 Mondays. 9 Mondays. Oh, I'm not a huge fan of 8 a.m.s. But the course is required, so we can almost ensure that we'll at least fill. So that's always good. What's that?
Was this the only time that worked?
We could always find other times. No one wants 8 o'clocks. No one wonder why. I don't know. Oh, yes. 9, 10, and 11 are very popular. I don't know, possibly. I didn't say that. I didn't say that. All right. All right. So, any questions over what we covered? So, let's see here. Just updates this week in lab. We're going to go over Hardy-Weinberg. Please bring a calculator. You might maybe some extra paper just for scratch pads. We're going to learn how to use those equations, the Hardy-Weinberg equations, to estimate or to determine if a population is evolving or not. And then also, once we learn how to do the equations, we can it's all fine to talk about what happens when you violate the assumptions. It's another to actually see what happens. So in the lab, we're going to run through simulated mating experiment, where you guys are going to kind of pair up and swap alleles, and we're going to see what happens when we violate the assumptions we're going to look at drift, and then we're also going to look at selection. So when we have selection, we'll also discuss how to incorporate selection in those Hardy-Weinberg equations, and we'll see how close we actually got, in our class, when we impose selection versus what Hardy-Weinberg would have predicted. All right, so bring your calculator. This lab will probably go most of the time, so don't plan to be out of here in 2 hours. The lab will take most of the time. All right, so we left off origin of adaptation. So we talked about evolution, background. Now we're talking about the origin of these adaptations. Still talking about evolution itself. All right, and we talked about variation. We have to have the variation if selection is going to act, and selection basically is the ultimate force in evolution, the one that's probably most important in generating these adaptations. So we said our two sources of adaptation can be genetic, so that's our nature, or it could be phenotypic plasticity, which was our nurture type of component. And we said selection can only act on that variation that's caused by the genes. All right, and it's that variation that's caused by the genes could be heritable. So if it is heritable and selection is acting, then we can change these frequencies in our population. What affects the speed of this change? Well, the intensity of selection. Right? The stronger the selection, the faster our allele frequencies will change. The value of our allele frequencies themselves, so the closer we are to being equal to allele frequencies of 50%, the faster we'll change. And also this heritability, which describes how much of that genetic variation is actually due to additive variation. So variation that is going to be inherited or passed down from one generation to the next. All right, so as part of this variation, we can recognize then that when you have populations in different areas, these areas have their own selection pressures, and they can generate what are called ecotypes, which are genetically distinct populations. And these populations are going to be adapted to their local environment. So this kind of gets back to that role of contingency that we introduced very early on. Every environment has its own selective factors. Even though the environments might look identical, there's slight changes, slight variations that produce very different selection pressures, which could generate these seemingly identical populations, but they're actually ecotypes. They're genetically distinct. All right? So, can selection be the end-all, be-all in adaptations? No, not really. And the reason why I say not really is because selection isn't always going to produce the best solution to our ecological problem. All right? And that's what we're always looking for. We, as humans, we always strive to be the best that we can be, usually. All right? Everyone says, hey, be the best that you can be. I think there's commercials out there. Be the best that you can be. Is it Army? I think maybe it had an Army recruiting commercials. I don't know. Geez, I guess that could be decades ago where it has be the best that you can be. But we always think about being the best. Can selection produce the best? Well, maybe, but a lot of times we don't see the best adaptation. We don't see the best adaptation, and we refer to these as imperfect adaptations or non-optimal adaptations. So the question is, why? Why do we see these? Why doesn't selection produce the best fit? There's a couple of explanations. Explanation number one is that these adaptations are simply contraptions. They're modifications of existing structures so that the organism can survive. Doesn't have to be the best. It only has to be good enough so that they can survive and get the job done. An example is the panda's thumb. Does a panda bear, so you guys know what a panda is, right? All right, so does a panda actually have a thumb? Not really. I mean, if we look at the bone structure, you see what looks like it's a thumb. All right? But it's homologous with our thumbs. Not at all. Not at all. What is it? Well, it's this radial sesamoid bone that has elongated itself to kind of resemble a thumb. All right? Very different developmental process versus us, all right, our opposable thumbs. All right? Why does it have it? Well, we have to think about the environment in which these pandas live and the food source. What do they feed on? Bamboo. All of the bamboo? All right, so smaller bamboo. So how do they actually feed on it? All right, yeah, so what they're doing is, they don't just like grab it like, I don't know, like a thing of broccoli or celery and just like stuff it in their mouth. They grab it, and then what they do is go through the process of peeling off the leaves. All right, and it's not like picking the leaves off. They basically just kind of run their thumb down and kind of strip the leaves off so that they then consume the bamboo. How did that come about? Well, it came about because of their thumb. So if you can imagine in evolutionary history that these bamboos were feeding on these pandas were feeding on the bamboos, all right, and one individual just had maybe a bone spur. And that bone spur was just enough that gave that panda a little bit of an advantage at getting those leaves off so it could feed more efficiently. All right, if that bone spur, if the growth of that bone spur was genetic and heritable, then those individuals were going to leave more offspring. So now all those individuals have this little nubbin of a bone spur that just allows it to get the leaves off a little bit easier. And those individuals then maybe have a little bit longer bone spur then. Those with a little bit longer one, more efficient. So now we just kind of go through this entire process where selection's favoring those individuals that have the longer growth. All right? Eventually, to the point where we see what the panda as we see it now, which makes this growth of this bone, all right? This radial sesamoid bone which we have in our wrist, all right, our own wrist, has the projection that makes it look like a thumb. Is it the best at getting the leaves off? Probably not. I mean, I think we can think of better solutions, but does it get the job done? Yeah, it does. And that's kind of the point with these contraptions. It doesn't have to necessarily be the best. It only has to get the job done so that the individual can survive and reproduce. All right? So explanation number one for why do imperfections exist? It's because a lot of times these adaptations are just modifications of existing structures. It was variation that existed, and that variation just happened to be favored. Explanation number two is that evolution is a continuous process. All right? We recognize that evolution just doesn't happen and then stop. It's pretty much continuous. So going back to the panda's thumb, it might not be the best solution. Could we get there? Maybe. Maybe if we look in another 1,000 or 10,000 years, that panda will have the best there is to strip those leaves off of bamboo. But we didn't get there yet. We need more time to do that. All right? Another thing is that it can have the best adaptation at one point in time, and then all it takes is for the environment to change. And once the environment changes, then that changes all of our selection pressures, changes all of our fitnesses. So what could have been the best adaptation now is just an okay adaptation. Just so-so. It's an imperfect adaptation. Could we get back to the best? Yeah, possibly, if we have more time. So if we have more time, maybe we can get there. But the reason we aren't there was because the environment changed. All right? And a lot of time this comes down to our own perceptions. We think we know what the best adaptation is. We think we're outsmarting Mother Nature. But in reality, maybe we don't. Maybe we're missing something about that environment that means that there's a different selection pressure, or that the pressures that are out there are a little bit different. And this brings up another hypothesis that we can talk about, and it's called the Red Queen hypothesis. So the Red Queen hypothesis basically says that the environment changes faster than adaptations can arise by natural selection. This theory was put out by a guy by the name of Van Valen, all right, and he utilized Alice in Wonderland, or Alice Through the Looking Glass, all right, as the depiction. So if you've seen the movie, at least the old Disney cartoon movie, there's a part where the Red Queen's chasing Alice, and it's just constantly running, and the Red Queen's always there. It's almost like one of those nightmares that you might have where like someone's chasing you, and no matter what, they're always right behind you. Or you can say, you know, it's a horror movie, and again, don't get me wrong, a lot of times those individuals in the horror movies make awful decisions on where to go and where to run, all right? But it's the same idea. So if we relate the Red Queen to, let's say, selection pressures or competitors or predators, and we say Alice is our organism of interest, what this Red Queen hypothesis is saying is that our organism of interest is always going to have to change. It always has to stay in motion. It always has to adapt to some new and changing selection pressure because the environment's always changing. And this constant evolution isn't really getting the organism ahead in the game. It's not making them optimum. It's not making them, you know, to have the perfect adaptations. It's just getting them to the point where they are staying right where they are at in their place. So if that individual gets a little bit ahead, environment changes, brings them back down. So now they have to adapt a new or evolve a new adaptation. All right. If we're talking about an evolutionary arms race, like a host-parasite system, it goes in tandem. So just as soon as a host evolves an immunity, a mechanism of immunity, our parasite has to evolve some way to avoid that immunity. And it's just a back and forth contest. Is one more fit than the other? Or does one have the better adaptation than the other? No, they're basically locked in the same point in terms of our evolutionary fitnesses. We really don't change. All right? So this is the Red Queen hypothesis. All right? And it's part of the reason why we might not see our optimal solutions. And lastly, there could be constraints on evolution. All right? And the constraints on evolution really come down to the laws of physics. All right? What we perceive as the best adaptation might not be physically possible. And I think this is a pretty good image here that kind of demonstrates that. Right? We'd love to fly, right? I think I'd love to fly. Love to have wings. All right? But when we think about the forces needed to fly, right, the forces that have to be generated, we can't get by with wings of this size. Right? Those are way too small for us. Right? We have to have like monstrous wings. I don't know what the estimate is. I don't know, like 40 feet long. And that's completely impractical. Right? Can you imagine fitting through the door with the wings like that? No. All right? We've got physical constraints that prevent that from happening. Same thing, you know, when we talked about stabilizing selection and weights, birth size, right? We can't, even though larger individuals, larger offspring have better survival, there's a physical constraint on them. If they're too large, they can't be born. They can't get out the birth canal. So we have a physical constraint that prevents us from getting to the optimal solution. All right. But again, is optimal solution, is that what we need to get to? No. We only need an adaptation that gets the job done, that solves our problem, or solves our ecological or evolutionary problem. It doesn't have to be the best. It just has to get the job done. So that's why I put this up in bold. Selection isn't the be-all, end-all solution. All right? I don't want you to think it is. It only has to get the job done. It only has to get the adaptation that allows our organisms to survive. Questions? All right, so we also have this interesting aspect, though, because sometimes we know that an adaptation can exist. Adaptation might be out there in another population. But then we go and look at one population, and you can see that we actually don't have that adaptation. We have an adaptation that's less fit. We can solve our problem by, transplanting individuals from the good population down to the poor population. But, in a lot of ways, it's kind of unethical, right? Transferring species between areas. So Sewell Wright in 1931 kind of proposed an idea that would give us a possibility to make it to that optimal solution. And he did so by introducing this concept of an adaptive landscape. Our adaptive landscape is a graphical representation of fitnesses as a function of the phenotypes that are out there. All right, so here's a graph of our two-dimensional fitnesses. So fitness is on the y-axis, right? The higher up on the axis, the more fit we are. And then the x-axis is the range of phenotypes that could be exhibited by our species. Now note my change from population to species. We're going to say across the species we know this range of phenotypes can exist. And this curve, this fitness curve, represents the fitness curve for a population in a specific environment. So right now, today, this is what our fitnesses look like. All right? This is an adaptive landscape. And what Sewell Wright's trying to figure out is we have a population A right here at this peak. But we know phenotype B exists. So our population A has phenotype A. We know that phenotype B exists and that our organism can get to that phenotype. How can the population get there? Well, you could say, well, selection should move us there, but look at our fitnesses. We're at a fitness peak right now. And selection is always going to choose the adaptation that increases the fitness of our individuals. So if we're at a peak, can selection move us down? No, not at all. If we start down here on a slope, selection will push us up that peak. That's just the process of selection. Selection favors those individuals that have a higher fitness. So Sewell Wright says, how do we actually traverse this valley? If selection can't get us there, selection can't push us down, is it possible for us to ever get to this phenotype B, which would be the highest fitness, in this case, the optimal phenotype for this environment at this time? To think about it, we're going to switch to a three-dimensional view. So a three-dimensional view is the same as our two-dimensional graph, but in this time we're going to have gene 1 and gene 2. So we've got range of phenotypes of two different traits, and those two traits affects the overall fitness of an organism. It's basically a reality that a single trait doesn't exactly control all of our fitnesses. It's actually a mix of traits. So this landscape is more of our three-dimensional view. And we could be anywhere on this landscape. We could be at a peak, we could be down here, all right? We could be all the way over here. Point being that once this population starts to experience selection, selection is always going to push us up a slope. So Sewell Wright asked, how do we jump these valleys? How do we go from one peak to another? To do this, he proposed this idea called shifting balance theory. Shifting balance theory refers to a shifting balance of small subpopulations across a fitness landscape. That's its name. A shifting balance of small populations across the fitness landscape. There are three phases to this theory. Three phases to get us from a lower peak to a higher peak. Phase number 1, local differentiation and loss of fitness. First, we move off a peak. Second, fitness recovery. Once we make it near the peak that we're trying to get to, we're going to move up and increase our fitnesses. And then once we get there, one of our subpopulations will start sending out migrants to bring the entire population over to that new peak. All right? So these are the three phases. We're going to go step by step and describe each of them, including the requirements. All right? So local differentiation, fitness recovery, spread. So we will start with local differentiation. You guys ready? Give you a little bit more time if you want to get those. We're going to go down each one and talk a little bit more. I've got some graphs that kind of illustrate what's happening. And these next graphs are on the handouts that have been posted on Blackboard if you needed them. All right, we ready? All right, phase 1, local differentiation and loss of fitness. So this entire theory relies on our population, our large population, to be broken up into small subpopulations. All right, you're going to have small subpopulations. What causes these subpopulations? Could be habitat fragmentation. It could be social interactions, social structure of our organism. All right, we can think about organisms that live in herds. All right, so you can talk about some of the African antelope species. You can have a big population that consists of multiple herds. Well, those herds represent our individual subpopulations. It's a fragmented total population. All right. So what's going to happen is because we are fragmented, because we're working with these subpopulations, we have a very small effective population size in those things. Our total population could be large. Let's say 10,000, 100,000 individuals. But the fragments, the subpopulations, may only be, let's say, 1,000 individuals. Genetic drift is going to be playing a pretty big role in those subpopulations. And we need that because we're going to rely on drift to move us off a fitness peak. Is there any direction? No, not really. It's random. So our subpopulations, I've got, let's say, a couple of them, one in red and one in blue. We're going to be bouncing around. So our entire population is around this peak here, all right, right where they're bouncing around. And what's going to happen is you're going to see that small population move a little bit every generation. And it's moving not because of selection, but because of drift. So we require subdivided populations, and we need those subpopulations because the forces of drift have to exceed the forces of selection. That's going to allow us to move around the landscape. And by moving around the landscape, we're actually causing our subpopulation's fitnesses to decline. Selection didn't move us down that hill. Genetic drift did. All right? So, why are subpopulations required? Exactly, because genetic drift is strongest in subpopulations. So if we're going to rely on drift to move us down a fitness peak, we better have a smaller population size. What's the cost of that? What's the cost of having a small subpopulation? What's that? We're hoping for a fitness loss, so what's that? Okay, so yeah, possible loss of the subpopulation. Small populations more likely to encounter just a freak event that happens to wipe them all out. Entirely possible. We'll talk about extinction events in metapopulations and so forth. And I'll also mention now, loss of fitness, yeah, that can happen. We could also be going in the wrong direction. So that's also kind of a cost for it. But, it's random. It's random. All we need is one subpopulation to find its way over to a new fitness peak. So this is what this blue line is going to. All right? It just happens that maybe this population drifts down, so it is very, very bad fitness, really low fitness value, and selection then kind of takes it out. I mean, that's a consequence of this, but the benefit of this small population size is that drift is acting, and drift could possibly move us through that valley and get us to our targeted fitness peak, which is where we're trying to get. Now, drift doesn't have to get us all the way to the peak. It only has to get us to the base of that slope. Only has to get us to that point where selection can now push us up. And this enters phase 2 of our shifting balance theory, which is fitness recovery. All right? So eventually, our small population size gets to a place, gets to an adaptation where its fitnesses are actually pretty darn good. And what's going to happen is selection starts acting on that population, on that subpopulation, increasing the frequency of that phenotype. And as selection is acting, as these individuals with the phenotype start leaving more offspring, their population sizes get larger. As our population gets larger, the forces of drift start to decline. And we need that because we need the forces of selection to far exceed the forces of drift so that we can be driven all the way to that fitness peak. It's not enough just to kind of get near the base and bounce around. We need to get to that base, and then we need to have selection take over completely and move us all the way up to that fitness peak. All right, so we started off bouncing around all of these subpopulations. We're not talking about a single subpopulation. We're talking about many subpopulations just kind of bouncing and moving around in our fitness peak, around our fitness peak. And then some of them will kind of venture off, venture wider. Some of them get to a peak that is still a peak, but maybe not as good. And those will just kind of gradually go out, die out, compared to all the other subpopulations. But some of our populations, or one of our populations, might get to a better peak, and selection takes over and moves us up to that top. All right? Now, when we get there, now selection is acting on our population. It's keeping us there. Our population's doing quite well because they have the best adaptation at that time. Their population size gets larger, and then as their population size starts to get larger, they're going to send migrants out to the other subpopulations. Those migrants carry that higher fitness allele, that higher fitness trait, over to all of the other subpopulations. And now, those subpopulations don't have to evolve that trait. They don't have to go through the process of random drift. They're getting that allele through gene flow. And once they get that allele through gene flow, it's going to spread. So that allele is more fit than any of the other phenotypes in those subpopulations. That phenotype is going to leave more offspring. And gradually then, not only are all of these subpopulations being pulled to that new peak, they're being pulled due to gene flow, but the entire population, the collection of all of them, will gradually shift to be centered on that fitness peak itself. All right, so this process relies on dispersal, it relies on gene flow to pull that population across. Was selection enough to get us there? No. We needed genetic drift, we needed selection, and then we needed gene flow to get our entire population over to that new fitness peak. Did selection push us down into a valley? Nope, can't do that. Selection only ever increases fitness. We relied on drift to get there, to get through it, and then selection takes over, and our allele spreads via gene flow. Questions? Is this good? Interesting theory? Is it valid? Yeah. Okay, what makes it valid?
Well, if you look at the human populations, we come from different areas.
Okay.
So you have vast differences, like my wife's from the Middle East.
Hold on. Let me switch here. Let me change this capture device. Where's the big speaker? Someone swapped this. That big speaker was actually pretty cool. Let me check to make sure if this video. Audio. Okay, go ahead. So we were asking, why is it valid?
Giving an example of what validation for. Okay, so in the human population, you look at differences in where people come from, different, anyway, so like my wife's Middle Eastern, I'm more Scottish than I am anything else, so, or German, anyway. If you look at like her sister and her husband, they've got 3 kids. He's like me, he does better in the colder weather. She does not, she's better in hotter environments. Their kids, this is the perfect area for them.
All right, so the idea of maybe it's valid is we have human populations, they've been subdivided based on countries, right? And it's been subdivided, for a long time. All right, so you can have evolution happening within our subdivided populations. You've got these changes. And then we have potential selection could happen, right? So you have drift in the small populations. Selection can happen to increase it. And then we have migration, gene flow that starts to spread the genotypes. And eventually, we can kind of get to the point where we pull ourselves up. Okay. I guess the question I would then ask is, do we have evidence that this has actually happened? Here's the problem with this, is that in order to really prove it, you have to show that it's actually taken place. All right? We have evidence for each phase of this theory. All right? We can show genetic drift. Yeah, it's going to decrease your fitnesses. We have evidence of selection increasing fitnesses. No big deal. We have evidence of gene flow, spreading alleles and increasing fitness of those receiving populations. What we don't have is evidence for all 3 happening at one time. We have experiments, studies that can show 2 of them happening, but it's always that third that seems to be elusive. So if we don't have evidence of all 3 happening all in one population, in one species, is this really a good and valid theory? I'd say probably. I mean, it gives us an idea that allows us to get to a more fit situation. And it provides a way in which we could traverse those fitness valleys. And again, even though we haven't seen all 3 happening all at once, we have seen 2 of them in a population. Maybe we need to look harder. Maybe we need more time. And unfortunately, when you think about how quickly drift works, or how slowly, I should say, drift works and all this stuff, maybe we have to spend a lot of time and resources just to find that last mechanism. Why do we talk about it if we don't have evidence for all 3 phases? It's because it does give us a mechanism by which we could generate a more optimum phenotype. So this was basically a repeat. Only this last point was the new one. All right. So at this time, Sewell Wright came out with his theory. It was a very prolific time in population genetic theories, statistical theories, evolutionary theories, and there was a guy by the name of Ronald Fisher that read this theory, read the paper, and say, oh yeah, this is bunk. This doesn't work. And Fisher and Sewell Wright got into kind of an argument, old school argument, where their argument was played out in the literature. So Sewell Wright wrote the paper, Fisher wrote a rebuttal, submitted it, got it published. Sewell Wright came back and said, no, everything that you say is wrong. Then Fisher came back and said, no, you're wrong. and so forth. So there was a series of papers back and forth. And I think of all of the arguments, Fisher probably has the most valid argument against shifting balance theory. All right, so what is Fisher's argument? Well, number one, he says that populations are just inherently too large to be affected by genetic drift. So according to this idea, Fisher says that drift really isn't going to have much of an effect, if any, on our population. And even if it does have an effect, it's not going to drastically move one of these populations down a fitness peak. The population is just too large. So you can go back to our graphs of genetic drift. Fisher's on the graph on the far right of the image, where the lines are just kind of jagged and bouncing around the same number. That's Fisher. All right? Now, Sewell Wright came back and rightfully pointed out that, whoa, hold on, Fisher. You're assuming that we're working with a homogeneous population here. All right? In Fisher's idea, you go out to an area, you go out to San Angelo, and he's going to say, all of the cicadas that are out here constitute one population. And Fisher's like, hold on, no. You're assuming that all of those cicadas in San Angelo here are homogeneous, but we know that they're not. We know that there's habitat fragmentation that produces fragmentation in our populations themselves. We know that species have social interactions, social structure that produces this fragmentation. And Wright would argue it's that fragmentation, it's that social structure that's ultimately allowing drift to take hold. All right? Now that was kind of unconvincing to Fisher. Fisher still holds the fact that these populations are still too large, even if they are fragmented, that there's too much gene flow occurring between those subpopulations for drift to have a significant effect. However, Fisher did recognize later on in these arguments that perhaps we can have subpopulations at the periphery of the ranges. So at the very edges of San Angelo, you could have this subpopulation there that's sufficiently isolated from the bulk of the group that you could have drift occurring. And this kind of plays into speciation effects, or the mechanisms of speciations. Whereas those individuals that are at the very edge of their range that are most likely to encounter slightly different areas and the most likely to evolve new adaptations or increased frequencies of adaptations that allows them to expand their range and move to new areas. All right? So the first argument against shifting balance theory is that our populations are too large, drift can't really have an effect. And the second argument, and I think this is probably the most valid argument that he has, is that our fitness landscape changes faster than the populations. We know the three properties of fitness, and one of those properties is that it's a property of the environment. Fisher says that every year, when our environment changes, we're going to have a completely different landscape. So our landscape goes from this really nice topographic map where the mountains stay mountains and the valleys stay valleys to have this constant fluctuation. Peaks become valleys, valleys become peaks, year after year. So our population can be at a peak one year, and then next year they're in a complete valley. They're in Death Valley. Is it any consequence of them? No, it's not. It's entirely because our environment changed. And what Fisher would say is that when these environments change, selection takes over, and selection acts on those subpopulations. So what we end up getting is a random walk of gene frequencies around our habitat. So if we go through and look at our fitness landscape, these are our two phenotypes. We're going to project our landscape down. We've got a peak here. Let's say a peak here. All right, and we've got a valley in the middle. We've got this population here, centered right at our peak. All right, that's where we're going to start with. And then, erase that. Our population, this could be a valley, and then selection moves us there this next year. And then it changes again, and selection moves us there next year. every single time selection moves us back to wherever that peak is, or wherever we have a higher fitness. So in reality, instead of seeing a random walk that's due to drift, we're actually seeing a random walk that's due to selection, and it's a random walk because every single year our environment changes. All right? I think that's probably a stronger argument against shifting balance theory. Does it mean shifting balance theory is not valid? No, not really. Again, we have 2 out of the 3. We've seen evidence for it, all right, in populations. It just so happens we haven't seen that third. But if it isn't true, I think it's probably this thing that we're going to see. Random walk due to selection. All right, questions? All right, some take-home points. Kind of wrapping up the evolution part, and then we're going to get into adaptations and the benefits of these adaptations. All right, so this kind of summarizes this presentation and the previous presentation. So 2.1, presentation 2.1 and 2.2. Number 1, not all traits are maximally efficient and or adaptive. This goes back to our optimality. Not all traits are going to be optimal. Question is, why? And I'll leave that for you to kind of go back into your notes to look. And what we'll probably do on Wednesdays, we'll come back to this and we'll try to answer just that why question. All right. And also, how can we become optimal and or more efficient? How can we do that? All right, go back to your notes, kind of find some answers to those questions. All right, so number 1, take-home point, just know, not all traits are going to be optimal. Not all traits can seem adaptive. Second is that our evolutionary process is dynamic. It's not going to happen and then stop. All right? Selection's always occurring. Drift is always occurring. Gene flow is always occurring. Mutation, it's always occurring. Everything that we see today was a consequence of what happened in the past, and we're still going to change tomorrow. All right? So our populations are still going to be changing because of these mechanisms of drift, and also our environment is going to be constantly changing. And anytime our environment changes, it's going to change our fitnesses. It's going to change our processes of selection, mechanisms. It's going to change what are going to be optimal and so forth. And it doesn't even have to be year versus year. It could be week versus week. It could be day versus day. Just kind of depends on the organism itself and the lifespan of the organism and what they have to deal with. All right? All right, so I have another quiz over this presentation. I am going to go ahead and release it. So if you wanted to take it, you can. That quiz is going to be due by the end of the day on Friday. All right, so these quizzes, they're not meant to be comprehensive. They're only meant to kind of cover the presentations, the numbered presentations. So I think I named the quiz quiz 2.2 to correspond to this presentation. Make sure you review your notes before you try to take that quiz. All right? All right, we're done. If you have any questions as you study, please write them down. You can email them to me or bring them to class on Wednesday. Enjoy the Monday.